Today's special guest, Gerald Celente from the Trends Research Institute. Since the Super Committee on Capitol Hill failed to reach an agreement over a deficit fix, an automatic $1.2 trillion in spending cuts from domestic and defense budgets looms over the economy, a.k.a. sequestration. Just days away, and joining me with his take on this and related current events, Gerald Celente, the director of the Trends Research Institute. His team produces the TrendsJournal, hard-hitting, in-depth analysis of the economic, social, political, and cultural trends. Welcome, Gerald Celente.
Thanks for having me back, Chris.
You know, I'd like to begin the discussion, if we could, today with the latest hot-button topic on Capitol Hill as sequestration. You know, the ominous-sounding plan was delayed until March. Capitol Hill may be required, though, to make about $85 billion in cuts if they don't come up with a plan. And then ultimately, it's $1.2 trillion in broad-based government spending cuts. These jobs, the last bastion of employment, you know, the government jobs were half of America virtually. Well, if they start cutting there, that seems like the backbone of our nation.
And when they really get finished with it, what you're going to start seeing is more and more things like unemployment insurance, unemployment being cut, shortening the days of that type of thing, social programs being cut back. Marginally on the military. Let's not forget, when we're looking at the military budget, we're looking at military and military-related expenditures are about $1.2 trillion a year. And what's really disgusting about this whole thing, this has been going on since the summer of 2011, and they haven't been able to come up with a deal yet. Anyone in the private sector could never get away with this kind of mismanagement and incompetence that Washington is getting away with. And it's really reflective of where the nation is going as a whole when we see this kind of shenanigans being played out in front of our eyes, that they can't come up with a deal to bring the government in line with spending cuts that should have been there a long time ago, considering the depth of the deficit and how it keeps building.
Since the year 2000, about $5 trillion in our national debt. Fast forward about a decade or so, we've tripled it to over $16.5 trillion, $800,000 in the Pentagon, face 1 day of furlough a week for about 5 months, customs agents, air traffic controllers. There's quite a list here. I won't run through the whole thing. I think you alluded to the ultimate outcome we're going to see here, and that is that it won't be a drop in the bucket by the time it gets through, because if they pull the punch bowl away from almost every household has some type of government check coming in, whether it be the SNAP food stamp debit cards, all the way to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. That's not to disparage the programs, but ultimately we have to pay for it, and the bill is piling up. What do you think?
Well, yes, but the big bill, again, that's one of the big bills, but the biggest bill is this defense budget. This is anathema to everything that this country was created upon. You read the words of the Founding Fathers. You could go from Madison to Jefferson to Washington. They were all against becoming involved in foreign entanglements. Hey, Chris, isn't it wonderful? They're just opening up a new drone base. I mean, that's a big, important place. How about expanding, the Asian front as well? What's going on with this country, and how come nobody's speaking out against this? Look at those wonderful wars that they waged in Afghanistan and in Iraq. What wonderful victories. I can't forget that humanitarian mission in Libya. You remember that one, that scope-limited, time-limited, kinetic action, as the White House spokesman James Carney called it? This is a disgrace. So if you want to see how this country is going down and why it's going down, let's look what President Eisenhower said and warned us about, that the military-industrial complex was taking over the nation. And this is coming from a 5-star general, forces.
There is one other lone voice in the wilderness who's been on this show as well, Mr. John Perkins, the Confessions of an Economic Hitman author, and I know he shares your sentiments with regard to how the economic base is built upon this military-industrial complex that you outlined. I also wanted to ask you about this budget office numbers here. The estimates show that we could see our employment numbers drop by about 750,000 jobs this year alone, and watch the GDP drop by about 0.5%. If these cuts go through, 2 months of employment gains, our typical 2 months of employment gains, plus a sizable chunk out of our GDP, which has been staggeringly low. Do you think that this is going to, significantly impact corporate profits and thusly the markets?
Well, yes, but, there's so many other things that are affecting corporate profits as well. Let's go back to campaign 2012, the presidential reality show. We heard from both the Republicans and the Democrats how they were not going to raise taxes on the middle class or lower classes. Well, they did. They raised the Social Security taxes, the payroll taxes. And it's showing now at the consumer level. The people that could afford it the least are paying the most. So we're also looking at, when we're looking at job growth, as you mentioned, they're barely creating enough jobs just to stay even. We have to create about 150,000 jobs a month. That's not accounting for, the new people moving into the workplace. And they haven't done that when you look over the long-term numbers. So we're falling back on employment. This is only going to make things worse. And then what you really have to do is start looking around the world. The numbers out of Europe this past week, I'm shocked. They downgraded their forecast for growth. They always do that. In the beginning of the year, they come up with a high forecast, and then, several months go by, they downgrade. And then you look what's going on in China. It's the same thing. We're getting fake numbers out of China, and when you're looking behind the numbers and where the real growth is, we're lucky if we're going to see about a 5.5% rise in GDP in China, which is not enough coming from that country. So this is a global slowdown, only making a bad situation worse.
Let's switch gears for a moment, please, over to the latest from the Fed. Hawkish comments have been the norm lately. I think that's been leading a lot of folks to believe the Fed could stop their QE-related monetary stimulus as soon as this year, perhaps even allow rates to climb a bit. However, we saw a 180-degree about-face this week, actually today. Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke suggested in a speech before Congress that the QE $85 billion bond buying program will continue. What are your thoughts here? And it seems like very important for the precious metals and stocks as well.
Well, it is important. I mean, we saw gold jump over $20 an ounce on the news. And again, it's very, very important, Chris, to understand this is the only thing that's keeping the markets afloat. Are these radically low interest rates. Look at housing again. Housing prices are going up because interest rates are so low. And what they call QEs is really nothing more than money printing, but it's not only in the United States. All the countries have different names for it. I love the one from Europe, ongoing monetary transactions, or long-term refinancing operations. So they're all doing it. They're all printing money to keep the Ponzi scheme going. And what they're doing is they're debasing the value of the currencies, thus the talk about currency wars. Oh, I forgot Japan. The markets went up a couple of days ago on the good news that Japan is going to stimulate their economy by printing more worthless yen. Who could get away with this? These people are bringing down the governments of the United States, of Japan, and Europe are destroying the wealth of their nations by printing this cheap money.
I read an article this afternoon that indicated Britain is considering negative interest rates. We've run out of options. We've tried the printing presses. We've tried holding rates low. Let's go negative. Because if you really delve into the numbers, you notice that real rates are already negative.
Well, you nailed it. And by the way, it is England. You're correct on that. And it is the savers that are being hurt. And that's why you're seeing here. Go back to Davos several weeks ago. The letters that came out of Davos were LBOs, leverage buyouts. You're seeing the merger and acquisition activity now. Why? Because interest rates are near zero. Money is cheap and it's easy to borrow. And the other reason that the markets are gaining any strength at all is because where are investors going to put their dough? There used to be a quaint thing in the United States when I was a young man. It was called savings. That's right. People used to put their money in the banks. They call them savings accounts, and you would get an interest that was above inflation for the money that you put away for a rainy day. Can't do that anymore, and they know what they're doing. They're forcing people to speculate. You know, gold prices, Chris, as I believe, should be well over $2,000 an ounce now. But I truly believe with all my heart and all of my professional credentials that they're forcing down the price of gold because they're debasing their currencies at home. As I said, whether it's Europe, Japan, China as well, they're dumping money into the system. They're just doing it differently. And Japan and other nations. And what they're doing by doing this is that if gold prices start shooting up, people are going to see how worthless that digital paper, not worth the paper it's not printed on, is worth. So when I say they're rigging it, well, can you dig this? They rigged the interest rates, LIBOR. Everybody knows it. It's a stated fact. If they could rig hundreds of trillions of dollars worth of interest rates, you think they could rig a thinly traded gold market?
Here's an alternative hypothesis. What if the dollar rally, which really I think has knocked the wind out of the precious metals, hopefully just temporarily, because it kind of seemed to come out of left field. I believe that this is probably tied in with the sequester scenario that we see. Maybe March 1st rolls around and our legislators vote on whether or not there will be cuts. Hopefully they make the right decision, although I guess we would be essentially be winning the battle and losing the war when I call it the right decision. Perhaps that might help cap the dollar rally and give the metals a boost. What do you think?
Well, again, you know, the dollar's only rallying because the other currencies are weak. Dollar's not rallying because of the strength of the dollar. And then, of course, they're going to try to beat down the dollar because the big game is exports. And if the dollar becomes too expensive, the United States can't export product. And when you see the Obama administration's promise to double exports, you know where it's coming from. And what they're going to do, I believe, in Washington, is they're just going to cut social programs out. That's all. They're going to hurt the people that hurt the most already. Whether you agree with it or disagree with it, those are the ones that are going to suffer. I mean, look at, you know, there was something out of Bloomberg that hardly made the news. The headline read, "Why should taxpayers give big banks $83 billion a year?" And it was by the editors. And they're showing how by these biggest banks, the too big to fails, getting such cheap money, it's really we the taxpayers that are subsidizing them. And their $83 billion in profits wasn't profit at all. They were really subsidies from the taxpayers paying this. So what I'm saying, Chris, is the bigs aren't going to be hurt at all. Any of this money that's going to be drained out of the system is going to hurt the people that, as I said, can afford it the least. Whether, again, you agree with it, that they should cut it or not is another issue. So it's not going to affect the economy that much. And what the reality is, I see it is that all of these currencies are being debased. So it's the stronger of the weaker currencies. Look what just happened in Italy. And look what happened with the stock markets. I mean, the market was up in the morning a couple of days ago when the numbers started coming in from Italy. Bersani government was going to be formed. The stock market jumped up. And then when the numbers started coming in and said, it looks like there's not going to be a government here because the numbers are so thin between him, Berlusconi, and Beppe Grillo, that all of a sudden the market took a tank because Italy would not be able to continue with its austerity measures. And you know what austerity measures are? That means banks make bad bets, and you take the money from the people to pay them off.
Let me throw a wrench into the works here. Do you really believe that our officials will allow programs like the SNAP food stamp card, which incidentally is on the chopping block here, along with all the other programs we were talking about earlier, if they follow through with these cuts, 47.8 million people require those cards to put food on the table. Could we not see something like Greece, or maybe even something like the Great Depression, where soup kitchens and bread lines form all around our major cities?
Yes, we could, and that's the only reason why you don't see it now, because of these programs and the numbers that you point out. The amount of people on food stamps and the poverty level growing the way it is, but the food stamps keep the people off the streets. So again, this is where I see it coming from, the social programs. Even when they cut defense, they're talking about $50 billion a year over 10 years. You're looking at an F-35 program that's going to cost in its entirety over $1 trillion alone for a loser airplane. Again, who are we going to fight these with people from Mars with these planes? There's no other government. Who are we being attacked by? So again, the big cuts aren't going to come from where they should, as I think. They're going to come from the people that could afford it the least. But the bigger issue again is, how is there going to be growth in the United States? Where will there be job growth? What sectors will thrive? How are these young people that are getting out of college, that have over $1 trillion worth of debt, more than consumer debt, how are they going to pay it off? How are they going to buy homes and start families? How are they going to find jobs when 50% of them that do find jobs that pay wages that are equivalent to high school diploma wages? So those are the real issues. And the answer is they're not going to do it. The country's on a steady downhill slide, and how anybody could believe that either the Republicans or the Democrats or the Gambinos and the Bananos are going to turn this around, the same people that caused the problems, to me, it's insanity. It's repeating the same thing over and over again, as Einstein said, and expecting a different result.
So let's shift back over to the precious metals for a moment. I'd like your take on this repatriation of the gold, national gold, back to Europe. We're seeing that as well, of course. Venezuela, they had all their gold returned. But, when it comes to the United States, we, unlike France, are requesting 6 to 7 years to return the Bundesbank's gold. And that's kind of raised some red flags right away, questioning whether or not we actually have leased out our gold, whether or not it's actually available, or whether the Treasury and the Fed are going to have to purchase the metal on the open market over the next few years in order to make good on their promises.
I don't think the gold is there. Does it take Germany, to 2020 to get their gold back? Were they going to bring it over by carrier pigeon? What's the big deal over here? I want my gold. Bring it on. Bring it to me. I think they have boats now. I'm not sure. There's a lot of baloney. And here's the other thing, Chris, to really put it into perspective. What are we looking at? We're looking at probably about 133 billion euros worth of gold. That's chump change when you look at the GDP of Germany.
That really kind of brings home, I think, the point. It must not be there, because it wouldn't be such a Herculean effort, I think, to simply ship those bars back over. Oh, yes, it might have to be done covertly and clandestinely, perhaps, in order to protect against pirates or something. I certainly like your carrier pigeon idea. But in the final analysis, it just raises some red flags, and I think that ultimately we may see some more, market manipulation to drive down the metals so these officials can get their hands on cheaper metals.
Yes, and by the way, look what's going on over in China and in Russia and other governments becoming big purchases, central governments buying gold.
The BRIC nations, absolutely.
And at big numbers, and particularly when you see what Russia's done over the past, decade or so. There's a lot of gold being purchased. So I believe that, the real issue here is, for example, in the United States, what's the big secret over here? I mean, isn't this supposed to be a democracy of we the people? Why can't we see the gold? The politicians and the Federal Reserve people. You're not allowed to see it. You only go to work, pay taxes, and do as you're told, and don't ask to see the gold. Behave yourself. What kind of country is this? What's the big secret? I'll tell you what the big secret is. I don't believe it's there. Because as I said, if the gold is in, if Germans had the gold in the United States, they have it in France, they have it in the UK, why can't they get it back right away? I mean, come on. I mean, the United States could bomb any country it wants to. You can't ship some gold, overseas. It's going to take till 2020. No, to me, it's a whole. It's one big lie.
I like the points you raised with regard to China. There is talk that they're secretly accumulating huge amounts of gold in anticipation of further currency wars, dollar weakness, and maybe even a gold-backed renminbi. In order to keep the established gold to reserves ratio, that's one of the requirements they have there, at about 2%. Their monetary reserves, our currency reserves, are up to $3.3 trillion now. As that keeps skyrocketing, the reserves, that 2% requirement means they have to keep making these purchases, and that's probably why they're soon to eclipse India as the world's largest gold producer. What do you think?
I think you're right. And I also believe that when I know what's going on. When you look at China as well, more and more people, more and more countries are trading with the yuan, and they're opening up more and more banks in other countries. Whether it's Singapore doing more business with Taiwan, and even Japan, who on one end they're fighting this war over these islands, but on the other hand, they're doing more trade with them. So I see the dollar losing its status more and more as a reserve currency, even with this fiscal cliff into its next stage, regardless of what the United States does. As you pointed out before, we're dealing with a $16.4 trillion deficit. There's no way in the world that deficit is ever going to be paid off except one way, and that's devaluation of the currency.
Sure, we've got a little bounce in the greenback, but ultimately, I think our officials know that there is a race underway to the bottom. And what do you want to hold in your portfolio when currencies are declining and inflation is soaring? Of course, you need some precious metals insurance. Any other topics that you'd like to discuss?
Yes, one of the ones, we just touched on it briefly. What's going on in Italy is big news. And that is that the media has derided Beppe Grillo as a comedian. How about what's going on in this country? These guys aren't comedians here. But the important thing is it's a model for the new millennium. He gained some 26% of the vote, and he's not running, just the Five-Star Movement Party, the people running under it, without ever appearing on television, without going to any of the mainstream media. This was done on the streets and over the Internet. It's very significant because it's a huge push toward people power at a time when virtually the entire global media tried to ridicule and deride the movement but it still had very strong power to make a huge difference. And I believe this is going to be a model of the future. More and more Internet candidates are going to come forth as the media, the mainstream media, no longer matters.
We're in the same boat, aren't we?
Well, yes, but worse in many ways. Of course, Italy has a debt to GDP ratio of about 127%. But, and then what they're calling recessions over there are depressions. There's a depression in Greece. You have 27% unemployment in Greece and Spain. In Italy and Portugal and many of these other countries, you have youth unemployment over 50%. And in the United States, of course, our employment numbers lie because once you're no longer receiving unemployment benefits and you can't find a job, they take you off the rolls and you're no longer considered unemployed. I mean, Stalin would have loved doing a deal like that. I mean, that's kind of a method that's very apt for the former, communist nation.
I think he would have inwardly blanched at anyone who had the cojones to try to pull that stunt. I don't know that even his nation or his regime would have thought they could have gotten away with half the stuff that's occurring today. It's surreal. It's Orwellian, don't you think?
It is Orwellian. And again, if they were doing that, then this country would be ridiculing. We would be ridiculing any nation that's doing what this nation is doing. And this whole thing, you go back to our TrendsJournal because we're writing now the spring journal, and we're writing a lot about what's going on in Italy and Cyprus and Bulgaria, all of these uprisings that are continuing, the corruption in Spain. And I'm reading what we wrote about the technocrats when they came in 2011, and how they were pumped up as these glorious masterminds that were going to solve the problems in Greece and in Italy. And of course they haven't. All they've done is they've pushed these countries deeper into poverty. And that's what's going on everywhere. And it's very, very simple. Who made this up that the banks can't fail? This is not capitalism in the United States. There is no such thing in capitalism as too big to fail. That's called fascism, the merger of state and corporate powers. And anyone that thinks that that's not the definition, they're wrong. That's the definition that Mussolini called it.
Well, as we wrap up here, we've run over on time, but in a quick sound bite, precious metals, buying opportunity here?
Well, I don't give financial advice, but as a trend forecaster, I keep buying gold. And as a good friend of mine, his strategy to me was the best over a long period of time. Every month he buys all the gold and silver he can afford. And when you put that over many, many years of life, you have a real great profit, and you've really took the whole range and leveled it to a straight line of profit up when you average it out.
Sage advice. Gerald Celente, the head of the Trends Research Institute, we want to thank you again for a fantastic discussion and wish you continued success, sir.
Thank you very much, Chris.